Dynamics, average versus peak. So when we're talking about dynamics, we're talking about amplitude, so the loudness of a signal. Now, when we're trying to adjust and view the loudness of a signal, or the amplitude of a signal, or control the dynamics, we have meters that we're looking at to tell us how loud a signal is. And there's two main types of meters. There's average meters and there's peak meters. And we're going to look at the difference between these two. So, here's an example of both kinds of meters. You can see on the left is a peak meter. That's the yellow and red meter there. And on the right is an average meter. And you can see that the same signal, while on the peak meter hitting negative 0.1 on a peak, the average is at negative 12.6. And this is because these two meters are looking at the same audio in a different way. So the peak is taking the highest dynamic peak, the highest amplitude level, and it's metering off of that. Whereas the average meter is taking the average between the highest level and the lowest level of amplitude. And so it's averaging those together and getting more of a moderate in the middle kind of metering level. And so our peak meters, as we can see here, are the more common type of meters that we see. And we have those on stereos all over the place. All our tracks in most digital audio workstations have metering on them, and most of them are peak meters. And they're great for the purpose of showing us when we're going to be hitting red on something if our levels are too loud and there's going to be distortion or something like that. Okay, as far as average meters, we've seen these before. These are VU meters, and they definitely ring the bell of this is an older style meter. And they're less common nowadays, but they still have their purpose because they're not showing us when the largest peak is happening. They're showing us the average between the biggest peak and the smallest peak. This is important because the whole effects of dynamics processing, like compression and limiting and such, is all based on the difference between these two. And it's because we are looking at peak meters most of the time, but our ear hears like an average meter, like a VU meter, as you can see here on the bottom. So if we look at this example, we can see how we have two files. One file is an uncompressed version of a track, and the second is a compressed version. So what has happened is our compression has turned down the peaks and raised up the lower parts or the valleys. And so you can see how our uncompressed version is really a similar looking waveform to our compressed version, but the difference is some of these peaks have been turned down and everything else has been turned up. And so the way this works is because we turn those peaks down, we can turn everything else up because now we're not going to go over our peak meter. And the benefit of this is when we do that, our peak stays the same. As you can see on both of these, the peak is the same, but our average meter has changed. So now our average of our original is negative 26, and the average of our new compressed signal is negative 20. And what that surmounts to is that our signal appears louder. Now it's not actually going over the red, which you looked at this first one and said, hey, that's hitting negative 0.1. I don't know how you can get any louder than that. And the second one is hitting the same thing, but it sounds louder because the average signal is louder, and we hear in averages. So that's how compression works. It's kind of a magical thing where you're able to turn down the peaks, raise up the lower level audio, and therefore increase the average and make it appear to be louder to our ears, but at the same time, it's not actually hitting a higher peak. And so we're able to make it louder without making it distort or peak. And so it's kind of a beautiful thing, but just like everything else, has to be used in moderation and used subtly, and it can be a beautiful thing. And we're going to talk a lot about dynamics later on in the tutorial. So that is average versus peak.